super good to meet all you guys, and thanks so much again. I think everyone kind of knows me based on what I did with Naked and Afraid, and that is definitely part of my story. I don't think it's the most interesting part. I definitely know it wasn't the hardest part. Um, I think the thing I struggle the most with is when people ask the question, what do you do for a living? Because I never know. I'm like, ask me anything else, like get deep with me, like ask any questions, but that question in particular is the hardest because trying to put myself in a box of like one single label is really difficult. And I've had any number of jobs, from a butcher, a farrier, a taxidermist, a knife maker. I was a tree planter for the Forest Service. I was a professional mushroom hunter. I've had all these weird random jobs, but none of them really, I don't really identify with any of those professions. It's more like I have this obsession with learning and just experiencing. I think I'm like addicted to experience. And it all kind of came about a sort of interesting way. I was a kid. I kind of thought I had to go down this specific pipeline of doing really well in school, going to a good college, and then getting, a specific job. I thought I had to choose one job and stay with it. And that's kind of what I did. The problem was I was a really weird kid and I never really fit in. And I found going to the woods was my escape as far as feeling like I fit in for once, because the wilderness is the great equalizer, right? It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if you're like the weird kid that doesn't have any friends. Everyone's treated the same out there. And I kind of became obsessed with going out and just existing. And one of the biggest things I noticed was I was this alien in a foreign world that I would visit. So all the other animals, they like didn't have to go home at the end of the day and have their mom cook them dinner and like sleep in a bed and have all these items that were bought in a store. They all could meet their own needs out there, but I was this alien and I couldn't do that. And so it made me really upset, since I felt at home there in some ways, but I was an alien in another. So I just had this mission to become kind of this feral animal and see if I could fit in and see if I could meet my needs. Because historically, right, we all know all of our ancestors at some point lived and died by the skills they had to keep themselves alive. And it's only recently that we've been reliant on so much. And so I became obsessed with learning as much as I could how to meet my own needs. And when I was a kid, I didn't have, YouTube wasn't a thing, Google wasn't a thing. Like, it was all kind of books and trying to do research and trying to meet people, but the world was a lot, you know information was harder to obtain. So I really just decided I was going to go out, experience. I wanted everything to be a learning opportunity. So that's kind of how I viewed things, is like whoever I could pick information off of in whatever regard, I was going to do it. And I was still going to school. I ended up going to college, and I was still really obsessed with learning. But I didn't really see any options other than, very specific jobs that I could go and work. Like, being a survivalist wasn't on the list in high school for career opportunities, so I didn't know that was an option. But I ended up having this one conversation with this one person. It was like a 5-minute conversation, and it completely altered the course of my entire life. Definitely made me realize how, you never know what you say to someone and how it's going to change their life, because that guy completely changed my life. And basically, instead of focusing on these problems I had and making excuses for why I couldn't do something, he allowed me to see a way to turn those into opportunities. So for every excuse I had about why I was doing one thing and I wasn't pursuing what I loved, he had a reason that was bullshit, and why I could really do whatever I wanted. And it was about focusing on how to solve these, what I consider problems, by really looking at what was available to me. So I started realizing that, okay, so I'm in college, I have all these massive student loans, I'm going to have to leave, I'm going to have to work this job, I need X amount of money. I'm going to need a certain amount of money for rent, I'm going to need a certain amount of money for a car, I'm going to need all these things. And it's like, okay, well, what if you don't have a car? What if you don't pay rent because you don't live anywhere? If you really want to go and learn and travel, but you don't have money to do it, why don't you go and hitchhike? There was all these different ways of, okay, you need money for this. Well, how can you erase that need and come up with a creative solution? So it was kind of like this different way of looking at the world. And I realized that, what I was passionate about was learning survival, and I wanted to go and really pursue that. And I didn't need all the money and resources that I thought I did. So I just started doing it. I just kind of like jumped into the fire, and it started with throwing myself into really stupid situations, completely unprepared. And I kind of lived by the saying, the greater the need, the greater the result. So I created this need. I would put myself out there, and I needed to step up to the plate. And I realized that you don't know what you're made of until you're there, you know. And it may not have been the smartest thing, and definitely you know, I had some situations I was lucky to get out of, but it created this drive and this need to learn more. And it created it wasn't an acceptance of failure. It was a comfort with failure, not a permanent failure, but temporary failures, temporary setbacks. I was learning how to do the bow drill fire, which is like fire by friction. Well, I looked at like a manual, I saw this picture, and that's all I had to go by. So I spent 2 years trying to get my first bow drill fire, and I failed every single way you could possibly fail. But instead of being like, I can't do this, I give up, it was, okay, now I know how not to do it. Okay, now I know another way not to do it. And when I finally got the skill, and when I finally succeeded in making fire, I knew every way to mess it up. So going out into situations in the cold and the rain, in an environment where I didn't know the wood, I knew exactly what would mess it up and how I would get it wrong. And so all those failures actually helped me to succeed in a greater way. Whereas, you know, if I had tried and got it the first time, I wouldn't know why I got it. Instead, I knew exactly why I got fire, so I could troubleshoot and know how to do it in any number of situations. So I became, I almost was seeking out this failure, in the sense that I wanted to learn the hard way, because I knew that every single failure that I had was a lesson. And there's a difference between failure and quitting. There's a difference between having a temporary failure and not giving up and pushing through, and then, you know, just having, I think people who are uncomfortable with failure at all, they shy away from it so much that they don't want to try something they think they might not be good at, because they're so scared of that temporary failure that they quit. And I think that that's like a huge thing that's gotten me through a lot of what I've done. I think actually being a female too has helped me in this whole situation, as opposed to hinder me. I think people have always expected less of me, and it was always, oh, you're a good survivalist for a girl. But instead of taking that and kind of believing it, it was like, the way I looked at it was like, you know, I'm okay with anyone's perception of me, and I'm going to use that, not that I have something to prove and that I'm going to like, you know, I have to prove something. Instead, I just let go of my ego. I was like, you know, I don't have anything to prove. People already expect less of me, but I expect more of myself. Like, I don't expect to be given a free ride as, you know, good enough for a girl. It was like, no, I'm going to do the same. And I like surprising people. I like the fact that people think less of me, and that I can bring the same thing to the table as someone. You know, there's certain things that it doesn't matter what your gender is when you're making a knife, you know, but people tend to think, oh, she's going to be good for a girl. But I really think that I've found a way to use that to my advantage, and I think that's kind of how I go about everything. Is I'm like, okay, here's what it is. How am I going to choose to frame this for myself? Because I could frame it as a reason, you know, it's kind of goes back to that excuse versus opportunity thing. It's like, am I going to use that as an excuse to not be good, or do I see this as an opportunity to push myself further? And I really think that's everything, because you can't really control what other people think, what other people think of you. You can't control what happens in the world. It's like the focus and what you're choosing to focus on. And that has really defined my reality. And going out in survival situations, it comes up even more, because you see people who are kind of like the armchair survivalists, who might have like watched a couple YouTube videos and think they're an expert and have a big ego about it. And then they go out and they don't have, you know, the stuff they had in their backyard when they were practicing at home. And all of a sudden they're focusing on what's missing, and they're not seeing everything that's around them and how they can use it. And it's like the ability to focus on the positive that you have. Okay, I don't have, you know, a banana leaf in the jungle, but I do have all this bamboo. Like, how am I going to use that instead, even though what I really wanted was not there? It's like, okay, I'm not going to focus on that and be sad for a month about the fact that I don't have banana leaves. I'm going to be excited that I do have some materials to use, and just really focusing on what is there and what you do have. And you know, I think especially in today's world, the people that you see still doing well are the people that aren't focusing on what's missing. It's like, what do you actually have, and how can you kind of reframe it in your brain to make it a positive instead of really focusing on the negative aspects of it. um, and that's, it's just been huge for me being out. There was a time I was out in the Amazon. It was actually on one of the episodes of Naked and Afraid. What had happened was a bunch of people had quit, and so they brought me and another guy in to finish in this impossible location where the bugs were so bad that members of production were talking about leaving. And I remember asking one of the local guys, you know, what did the people that lived here do? Like, how did they combat bugs? There's got to be some kind of local plant or something I can do. And the guy's like, yeah, you know what people did is they didn't live here because it's too bad. At that point, it was like, all right, this is going to take a different framing to succeed in. And so being out there, the bugs were so bad that they gave us these bags that it was actually like for our mic packs, and there was these burlap bags, and we had to kind of wear them all the time. Well, at night we actually ended up wearing the bags on our heads because the mosquitoes were so thick that you'd actually choke on them. So we actually had to use these bags as like a filter. That's how bad it was. And I remember one night, just, it was so terrible, and you're just getting devoured. And if you focus on the fact that there's these little, you know, annoying creatures that are like biting you, it's like, well, is it going to kill me? No. Is it going to drive me crazy? Potentially. And the people who focused on the fact that they couldn't stop the bugs from being, you know, from biting them, it was like they couldn't control that, so it just broke them. Whereas I quickly realized I just had to reframe my focus, and I took a walk down to the river, and I sat on the bank, and I mean, the bugs were still there, but it was this amazing night, and there was a storm going on downriver, and upriver it was like clear skies, and there were lightning bugs everywhere, and the stars were out, and it was like this crazy light show. And it was like getting to focus on that moment and what I was experiencing, and like the gratitude, as cheesy as it sounds, for getting to witness this and just being in this moment. It's like the bugs became unimportant. It was like it was worth the price of admission to be there and to get to experience that. And so it was like focus completely changed my reality. And in that moment, it was like that had to become the greater reason, the greater drive, the greater, you know, purpose. Because if I focused on trying to stop the bugs, it was like it was always going to be fighting a losing battle. And I think that's a big thing too, is going out on that show. I really realized that I went in there with the full intent that they were going to have to like take me out in a body bag in order to get me to leave. I didn't see quitting as an option. And I think the people who end up leaving, they go in knowing that there's a panic button, right? There's like that oh shit button they can press, where if they hit that, they can leave. And if they know that that's there, you're going to hit that button. But if you go in with no other option other than finishing, it's like, well, you're going to find a way to finish, and you're going to do whatever it takes, and you're not going to leave. So it's like not making that even an option in your mind. I mean, for me, that was huge, because I think we're kind of, in a way, I think we're programmed to want to seek out comfort. And that was something that I think just through human history, we had so many different things thrown at us all the time throughout the course of human history. We didn't need to create our own drama. There was plenty of that. So trying to seek out the path of least resistance and trying to seek out comfort was actually a great survival tool. I think the problem in our world is we are so, you know, a lot of people, I mean, Marines, active duty military, like probably the only exception of not having to live in a little bubble. And I think being able to have those different forces coming in and getting comfortable with things that are out of your control and that are creating you know, something different, something challenging, um, you have to learn to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I think that like anything else, it's practice. And when I first started doing all this, you know, I lived in a very safe little bubble of suburbia for my whole life. And so the first few times it was obviously terrifying to be out of that little safety net. But every time I went and did something and, you know, it turned out okay, and maybe I had some close calls, but I survived. It was like, oh, okay, like I guess maybe I can do that again. And the next time it became a little easier, and the next time a little easier. And it was like, you know, it was the more practice I was getting, the easier it was every time, and the better I was able to deal with that kind of pressure, and the less afraid I was. And as time went on, it actually became something that I I started to seek out, because in those moments of discomfort, I knew that I was alive, and it was this feeling of like not just existing but actually living. I remember there was this one time I spend a lot of time out in the mountains, and there's a specific region I always head into, and I look for antlers. I like to spend a month out there in the spring, and it's April, so it's like, you know, 33 degrees and raining for the entire month. And it's, you know, there's snow some days, it's cold, it's wet. And I'll go in and I'll pack all the food that I'm going to have for the month on my back, so my pack away as much as I do. And no matter what I do, no matter what shoes I wear, my feet end up getting destroyed. It's like all the weight from my pack, it just like expands my feet, and it gets to the point where you know, I lose all my toenails, the bottoms of my feet become these big pillow blisters, and my feet basically look like hamburger. And I'll be walking barefoot through the snow, because that's more relief than trying to like jam my feet into shoes that they don't fit in anymore because they've like widened. And the last time I was out there, it actually got so bad that when I finally got to my destination, which is like 50 some odd miles in, I went to bed, crashed out in my sleeping bag, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and like I had to get out and pee, and I couldn't get my feet to tear off of the sleeping bag because the open wounds had dried to the inside of the bag. And it was one of those moments where like, and people hate me for it when they're out there with me. I was alone at this point, but I just start uncontrollably laughing, because it's like one of those situations you just end up getting in that if I had had that happen, you know, 15 years ago, it might have been a different story. But at that point, I'm just like, this is like living. This is a story. You know, this is like an experience that I'm never going to forget. Whereas if I was sitting at home, comfortably scrolling through social media, days go by that they're wasted days. They get lost in the mix. They don't matter. And it's those moments in those situations that I have learned are the ones that I look back on the most fondly. So it's just become this quest for me to constantly go out and constantly push myself and constantly create these situations. And I think the more I expand the boundaries of my comfort zone, the further out they get. So like the greater levels I have to go to. And even though I think I do things, you know, I think I've learned enough to be slightly more cautious. There's still a way to kind of push those boundaries, and you know, not almost kill myself every day, which you know, I think that's another thing, is people look at what I do and they think I have this death wish. But like I was saying, it's not because I want to die, it's because I want to live. And for me, you know, I know that I try to live knowing that I could die tomorrow and have no regrets, and feel like I've accomplished a lot. But at the same time, I could live to be 150 and not accomplish a fraction of what I want to, because I want to just do and experience everything. And that's kind of what's driven me and gotten me to where I am. And I don't know, I just think like being out there and having those experiences, it's hard for me to go back at this point and think about not living that way. So that's a little bit about who I am and where I come from. But I'd love to open it up to any questions you guys might have.
I'll ask the first one. All I could think about, especially in the last half of the points you're bringing up in your experiences, is at the military has a SEER school, and in the SEER school, they teach you. Let's say you've been captured and you're being interrogated. One of the things they teach you is that no matter what, you're imprisoned, someone has control of you, but you can learn how to have control. Let's say the rate at which you breathe. No one can control that. You can control that. And so at least that's one less thing that someone can take away from you. If they try to take that away from you, then maybe the amount of times you blink, it's like a small victory. And so they show you that, and you kind of experience very like 0.0% of what that's like. But I can't imagine what it's like to Mother Nature or the environment to have that kind of domination over you. And like you were just describing. So, is there techniques that you have developed over time, maybe whether it's like small peaks that you say, oh, let me just get to that peak and then we'll make a decision there, or do you just go all the way in, saying I'm not stopping until I reach my final destination?
Yeah,
How do you break down small victories, I guess you could say, when it comes to the environment?
for sure. I mean, I think I really try to look at it more whole picture. And that's just because there's always so many different variables that are coming into play that I don't necessarily know how. I mean, it's kind of like a metaphor for my life almost. Like, I didn't know how I was going to get here. It just kind of happened. And, maybe the goal for the day is like getting up this mountain and getting back down and all the things that are going to happen in between. But it's like I try to look at it whole picture, because for me, there's so little I can control, or there's so little I can be certain about knowing I can control, that the less I'm trying to manipulate that, the more open I am to different opportunities. So I think if I get too focused on a desired outcome, then you end up encountering more small failures. And even though I've learned to be okay with those, it's like, all right, greater picture, and being kind of like fluid with moving in that greater picture. And in that way, like, you find other opportunities. And I think the biggest part about that is just having the optimism to be excited about the small victories when they come up. So it's like, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to have this small goal and achieve it and celebrate, it's like, all right, I'm going to have this bigger goal, and I'm just going to find the victories and recognize them when they come up. So I think for me, I would end up having more victories that I didn't plan than, if I had planned them and tried to meet them, if that makes any sense. So it's like
Yeah.
learning to recognize when something is going well. And I mean, for me, sometimes that's as ridiculous as like, oh, hey, I'm still alive. Like, yes, victory, and just, I think it's that optimism, and learning to foster that optimism, and to celebrate the small things that you don't necessarily appreciate. And I think for me, the biggest thing that has helped me appreciate those is like having this contrast of, you don't know what it's like to be warm unless you're cold and you're hypothermic. You don't know what it is to appreciate food unless you've been starving. And so going through all these contrasting things and really embracing some of like those really dark parts, and sitting in those and being like, wow, like, this is going to make me really appreciate being warm. And then when I do experience like warmth, or even not freezing and near hypothermic, it's easier for me to say, hey, I'm super grateful that I'm in this situation where I'm not in a hypothermic state. So as simple, as ridiculous as it sounds to celebrate that victory, it's like being able to just see that and constantly check in with yourself and be like, you know what, I do have stuff going for me. Like, this is what I'm focusing on, and I'm going to be excited for that. Even though it's not, everyone's ideal or even my ideal, it's like, I'm still going to celebrate that.
Wow. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I've got one for you. So you've
Mm-hmm.
done a lot of things. What is left on your bucket list?
Oh my gosh, everything. I really want to go to Mongolia and hunt on horseback with golden eagles. I mean, that's definitely way up there. But really, it's just like everything I haven't done. I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, I think
Top two.
hunting.
Top
What's
two.
that?
Top
Top
two.
two. I would say the golden eagle Mongolia hunt is definitely way up there. And then I really want to get an elk with a primitive self bow. So that's I love elk hunting, and that's definitely way up there.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Wow. we're contemplating those two right now. Yeah. You just kind of hit us with a whooping stick right now, so we're all stunned.
I was just elk hunting with a rifle, and it destroyed me.
I know.
Like coming from the East Coast, going out west, it humbled me absolutely. Trying to run up the mountains, I was just gassed. I couldn't do it.
That's the best. That's why I love elk hunting, is because it's like it's always humbling. It's in the terrain that just you can't fake it. You know, that's what I love about it, is like you can tell yourself that, you know, I've known some amazingly fit people, and they get in those mountains, and you might be fit one way, but like being fit for Western mountains, like I don't know if there's a such thing as being fit enough to be in them. It's humbling and it's awesome, and I love it.
Wow.
So you kind of touched on it a few times back and forth, but if you could kind of narrow it down, and we talked about it a little bit, is the resiliency, right? So you go to your first episode of the first time you're naked and afraid, and day one you cut yourself with a machete. You know, you're like, oh, you know, the fact that it can get infected and all these other things. Some individuals, that's their tap out button, right? And you're saying like you know, in your mind it's there, but it's not there. So, but it is there. So how do you make sure, what do you do to say that it's not there without getting to that point? When do you know when to hit the tap out button or ring the bell or whatever analogy you want to use, so you're not to that point where you're facing death because you don't have a death wish, so you say?
Yeah, I mean, for me in that situation, I knew that the tap out button was there for other people, and I knew that it wasn't there for me. So if they decided that I was gonna, and that was a really weird situation, because, you know, I was kind of hoping they weren't gonna let me die out there, but also it was like I knew that there was no part of me that was gonna quit, even if it was really bad. I was gonna find a way to deal with it. I was gonna find, you know, a plant to battle the infection, or I was gonna, you know, figure something out. But I think I also had the luxury of knowing that I wasn't out there on my own. And at the end of the day, like, I don't know, if I thought that there was a moment that I was going to quit, then you're always questioning that, you're always focusing on that, and you're always, you know, wondering if it's time. And I just had to put that out of my head completely. And I mean, that was kind of a situation where I felt like my desire to accomplish the goal was so great that there literally was nothing that was going to happen that was going to make me tap out. And I think that's a hard thing. I think if I had been in a situation where I was solo, completely on my own, no satellite phone, no anything, it would have been a hard call for me. And I mean, infection is one of the weird things. Like, everyone thinks about the grandiose, you know, grizzly bear attack, or, you know, a shark eating you in the ocean, but it's like the small things like infection that can really take you out in that situation. Or, you know, some kind of disease. I got monkey malaria, no less, when I was out in the Philippines, and it's those little things that can come in and you know, really mess with you. And that really is the greater issue. So yeah, that's probably one of the harder things that you know, dealing with infection out there. It's a tough one.
Do you ever go out in groups at any time? And if you do you find yourself maybe scaling down depending on the challenge of you can almost kind of tell, like someone shows up and they got Nike running shoes and they have like no idea what they're about to step into.
Absolutely.
And how do you, and the only reason why I asked is I was telling one of the Marines the other day, we were in Estonia and training out in the open Estonian plain. And you know, the initial day, all the Marines and Estonians were all sizing each other up. And a week, two weeks into the training evolution, I was thinking about that day when we were all sizing each other up and how small the Marines ended up. We were just failing because these Estonians were just these hard people. And
Yes.
they grew hard. And these guys could like survive an entire day operating on a bag of soup. And, you know, the Marines had eaten all their chow for 3 weeks in 1 week because they were just broken mentally and the wheels were falling off. And we ended up scaling down the exercise just to like make sure the Marines could crawl across the finish line. I guess the real question here is when you're dealing with a larger group, do you ever find yourself adjusting your mark to maybe get the lesson and maybe not just break people? Because
Absolutely.
obviously, just in your own discussion, I'm having to like reframe like how do I mentally prepare? Because you're able to absorb so much more just from your own experience. So I'll leave that open-ended question to you.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I think it's one of those things where a lot of times I just can't get people to go with me because they just, I mean, I think to most people when I kind of explain what I'm going to go do, it just sounds like it's going to be torture. And I'm like, no, it's really going to be great. And everyone's like, no, you're insane. Like, we're not going with you. And I definitely have gone out with people and had them get injured and, you know, stuff like that and had to deal with things. So I'm like, maybe it's best I go out alone. But if I do know I'm going with someone and they're honest about their experience level, I think a lot of times people, you know, they can get an ego about them and not necessarily realize what they're getting into. I don't know which one it is, but if I go out with someone and I know that they're either uncomfortable, this is new for them, I mean, absolutely, I'll scale it down and it's still an enjoyable learning experience for me. I'm just learning something different. So that might be, you know, how to learn to be a better teacher, or, you know, experiencing something through their eyes. Like for me, teaching primitive fire, I love doing it because I get to experience it through someone else's eyes and like experience their process and vulnerability and everything they go through, like this whole range of emotions, and I get to like be there for it. So my focus there is, you know, it's on something different and it's seizing that opportunity for what it is instead of trying to make it about whatever goal I thought I had in mind. It's just having the flexibility to restructure it and be like, oh, okay, this is what I'm going to learn right now. It might not have been what I thought or planned on, but there's still something to gain. And, you know, I think that's been something I've been doing for a long time, is just, I really view everyone as someone I have something to learn from. Like everyone, no matter what they've done, what they haven't done, like their perspective or their experience, whatever their stories are. That was like, I used to just hitchhike back and forth across the country to hear people's stories, because it would put me in the situation with people who I would never otherwise meet. And I would always learn something from everyone. And some of the stuff that you'd hear and just like all these, you know, experiences of like the human collective, it's like there's always these little information and these little like nuggets that you can glean and use. And even if it's like what you don't want to do, you know, there's always something there. So I think going out with other people, it's just like, it's just going to be a little bit different than if I went out by myself. But I used to actually teach. I used to bring out inner city troubled youth. We'd go on like 2-week trips into the woods, and it was like, I learned more, I think, from them than they learned from me. And it was, it just ends up being different. And I don't think it's like a greater than, less than kind of situation. It's just different.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I actually got one for you. Kind of mentioned earlier how I go do this once a year. I go out into the woods and just disappear for, I only get a week because work kind of pulls me back in.
Absolutely.
I go out there to just clear my head and forget everything, get away from people. It helps you just relax just a little bit, because you can just forget about anything going on with your life, because your mind runs a mile a minute at work in your normal life. So you have a lot of goals that you do. You're like, I'm going out shed hunting right now, going out to do this. Do you ever just disappear just to be like, for no reason, just go out there and just get lost and clear your head and anything
Oh
like that?
yeah. I mean, I think really the shed hunting is just an excuse to get out there. So for me, it's like it's about the antlers in a way, but it's also not about the antlers at all. Like I've given most of the antlers I've found away. I don't even sell them. I just give them away because it's like they get me out there as like a drive so that I feel like I have like a goal or a purpose, but it kind of pulls me into the mountains in a more driven way that allows these other experiences to unfold. And the different things that happen along the way are far more interesting at the end of the day than the antlers that I'm finding. And I think it's huge. Like part of the reason that I like to go out for long periods of time is because it's like you're able to be present in a way that you can't be in our world. Like you're always accountable to your cell phone at any point during the day. Someone can be messaging you, reaching out, calling you, whatever. Like you always have all these different things going on where it's like, okay, what do I have to do next? You have these to-do lists, you know what day it is, you know, all of these things that are constantly going. And it's like your mind can never just be in the moment fully. And for me, just being able to flip over and be in that moment has been so useful. And it's like that's also the time when if you have demons in your closet, you know, like they're gonna come out. And I think for me going in there, it's almost like, you know, it's like therapy in a way. It's like free therapy because you go out there and it's like if you have little things that are going on when you don't have another person to talk to and you don't have to pretend to be anyone but exactly who you are because it's just you, anything you have going on, like you can't ignore it. And so for me going out there, it is about like being in the moment, clearing my head. And even though I have like specific, you know, quote missions that I go on, like I'm going to go out and see how many antlers I can find, like it's really not about the antlers at all. And I feel like most of the stuff I do is just like to give me a sense of direction about where I'm headed, but it's just like a reason to get out there. And I mean, some of the experiences I've had with wildlife, with just forces of nature out of my control, and even a lot of like the survival situations that I've been in have been through these other goals that I've had and putting myself into different situations. And it wasn't like I could have planned those situations, but the antlers got me there. So yeah, that answers it.
It does, yes. It's funny you say you get to learn yourself because that always happens when you sit alone by yourself looking at stars. You're just like, everything comes down because you put that face on for everybody else. And all you start realizing everything. You're like, well, maybe I'm not all right. And you start just relaxing, come back happy. So
yeah. Yeah, no, it's huge. I think like how much better like would it be if everyone just got to do that, you know? Because I think it's just I'll just deal with my own shit so that everyone else doesn't have to, you know, like I'll go in the woods and handle my own self so that other people don't have to deal with the baggage, because it's like, it's just, it's a really, I think it's like a good thing mentally for me, I know. And I think that's been one of the cool side effects of, you know, the whole COVID thing is more people are getting out and getting to be out in wild places. And it's like, I think like the effects of that and how people are just kind of reconnecting with that space and realizing like, you know, like I learned when I was a kid, the wilderness is the great equalizer, and you can go out there and like nothing else matters. You can just exist and just be and like be human for a second. And I just think it's been so important in my life. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who doesn't see that. Even if the only message or like lesson you learn out there is like, wow, I really appreciate my bed. You're like, I really appreciate my house. It's like, it's still important, I think.
Well, one of the challenges that we have here is we have our instructors who are much more mature and much more experienced than the entry-level Marines that we got. Just graduated boot camp. This is their first real kind of unit where they're learning their jobs, what they're going to do in the Marine Corps. And so there's this like imbalance. You have instructors really experienced, very young Marines, and there's nothing in between. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges, and you mentioned about working with troubled youth, so this is kind of related to that, is making sure they understand their place in the world, and there's so much opportunity and chance out there. So how do you relate these lessons? And And how do you talk to somebody and maybe so far removed from where you stand, and how do you connect with these people?
I really think it's just about finding some way to relate, like finding some kind of common ground. And that might be like a far stretch sometimes. People who have had a completely different life and existence, but finding some way, no matter how small, to relate, and just like seeing like that human in them and trying to relate. I always just try to relate it back to little parts, like, oh, this thing that they're talking about, or this thing that they did or are doing or have done reminds me of this part of myself. And it's like, in that sense, by relating to each person as an individual and trying to really be like observant and aware and finding those connections, I don't care who the person is, what their experience, how different we may seem on the outside, there's going to be some kind of relatability. Maybe it's like, oh, I recognize how scared you are, even though you might not be showing it. Like, I can recognize that, and I can relate to this one time when I first did this and I was scared. It could be as little as that, but having that, and then you just start to see them differently, and you almost have like this cord of like relatability that's there that you can use to reach them. And I think it works both ways, because if you're viewed, just as an unrelatable other, it's easier to not be open to like the learning, teaching kind of relationship. And it's like that dynamic and establishing the rapport and respect is huge. And I don't think that can happen without any sense of vague relatability, or, a lot of times that can come in the form of like someone aspiring to be someone else, but it's got to be some kind of mutual respect. And I think establishing that, having a common ground of some kind of like being, way of relating is huge. And I think it's just like, again, kind of like that optimism of, just looking for the good in that person and looking for like things in common, and not focusing on, all the negative, like bad stuff, even though that's always going to be there in some way, shape, or form, but like focusing on like positive, what lessons are going to be learned, and relating in certain ways. Like, I think you can just forge a connection, and that's going to help, both parties involved, and having that ground of mutual respect on some level. And that can happen in any power dynamic. I don't think it matters how great the difference in power is, or like, where that person is. Like, being out there, these kids were literally relying on me to live. Like, if they had gone and run off, like, they weren't going to be able to make it out there. But it didn't matter, because the respect kind of went both ways. But it was, it didn't affect the power dynamic at all.
It's interesting. Any other comments? I'll keep on going. So you have to tell me twice.
I've got one. So watching the show and like seeing the different type of people that are on the show. I mean, all different backgrounds, skill levels, so on and so forth. Two questions. One, how important is it in those situations to be in shape physically? All right. And then can you kind of rank what is most important as far as skill, physical in shape, mental, stability, like kind of rank what is the most important and what can kind of waver a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is probably going to be shocking, but the first thing I did every time I found out that I was going to be going out is I would stop working out and I would start eating as much food as possible, because muscle is going to burn more calories than fat. So if I'm like all ripped and I have, very low body fat, then I'm going to go out there. My body is going to start consuming itself. The second that muscle starts to get consumed instead of fat, like, you just feel it. Your energy plummets. And then you'll notice that the guys who go out that are like, or the girls that are just skinny and jacked, they have a really hard time. Like, if they're counting on a certain amount of calories a day and they don't get that for a day, 2 days, it's like their bodies just have no reserves to go off of. So I'm generally a fit person, and even though I'll be fit, it's more of like a I can go and walk around in the mountains all day, but maybe I don't have like all this extra muscle to like break my deadlift record. So it's like, it's a different kind of fitness, and it does not look like fitness, because I literally want to walk out there having people be like, wow, like she's a little chunky, because I know that that's actually food that I'm bringing with me. And there's a reason that our bodies, fat in our culture is very different than what it was originally intended. We have this luxury of being able to get, accumulate large amounts of fat, but out in a survival situation, it's actually a huge bonus. And that's why our bodies do that. You couldn't always rely on 3 meals a day. Like maybe it would be a week in between being able to eat. And like, are you going to have enough to sustain you through that week? Or are you going to be, crashing on day 2 because you're relying on this constant influx of food? So that's what's always worked well for me. And as far as the other, strengths, mental is like maybe 90%, maybe more. It's huge, because survival is really simple. Like, it's not rocket science. It's what are my needs and how do I use what's around me to meet them? And so sure, it helps if you know all these neat little tricks, and maybe you'll be able to, if you know how to weave a really nice basket, you could like extrapolate that and make other stuff and whatever. But like, if you don't know anything and you just know what's going to kill you first and how to prevent that from happening, then that's all it is. So having the mental attitude of being able to look at a situation with a sense of removal from emotion, like, oh, okay, I'm feeling scared because I have gotten out here and I don't know how I'm going to make it, and maybe I'll die. The problem is when people panic and they start running around in circles and they get sweaty, and then night falls and they freeze or run off a cliff or whatever. It's like, you think logically and, okay, what productive things can I do? I'm in this situation, out of my control at this point. What's still in my control? What do I have? I'm focusing on what I have, not what I'm missing. This is what I do have. How can I do that to prevent, this thing that's going to kill me from happening? And so it's like, that's all mental, and being able to kind of roll with the punches. I mean, that's going to get you a lot further than knowing a specific skill set. Like, there's very few survival situations people are going to find themselves in where if they 100% can't get a fire, they're absolutely going to die. Like, there's ways of being able to conserve your body heat and take away these ways that you're losing heat to actually make it through the night without a fire in a pretty cold situation. So it's like using ingenuity and having like the mental ability to separate yourself enough to not be emotional and to just be productive. That I just think mental is most of it. And physical strength, if you're not the strongest person, I mean, I'm never going to be as strong as like some, massive bodybuilding guy. Like, it's not going to happen. But there's ways I can use my ingenuity to maneuver around that and to like come up with other solutions other than just brute strength. So I think, whatever your attributes are, it's like, there's always ways to work around them as far as physical stuff. It's the mental stuff that you can't replace. Like, either you kind of, you can either foster that and have it, or if, some people at the first sign of struggle, they just want to throw the towel in. It's like anyone who's never experienced adversity in their life is going to be a lot more likely to throw the towel in when things go really wrong. And that's why I think it's so important to experience things that are uncomfortable, where you're not in control, before you need them. Because then when you do need them, it's something you've already gone through, and you can deal with it way better than everything's been great and fine and easy in your life, and then all of a sudden everything comes crashing down around you and you don't know what to do other than to just give up. So I just think the mental attitude is irreplaceable.
So going with your preparation, you say, you kind of stop working out and try to gain a little extra fat. What are some other things, like distancing yourself from air condition, not wearing shoes? Because I mean, you can get accustomed to that kind of stuff, kind of like in the military. We try to, not rely on the luxury. So when we don't have them, we're not falling back to that. You don't even want it in your mind. So what are some other things you do to keep yourself ready to go in the woods for 30 days at a moment's notice?
So I think one of the biggest things is just learning how your body does with hunger. So fasting is something like I do all the time, and I'll do it in different ways, and for different time periods, and it looks different all the time. But I think a lot of people don't know what, maybe you can even imagine how it would affect you physically, but the mental aspects of going without food, like people get hangry if they miss lunch, right? So it's like, what happens on day 3 if you haven't eaten? And also dehydration. Like, you're supposed to hydrate, right? Like, we all have water within an arm's reach of us. We all know we're supposed to drink water, but what happens when you don't have it? Like, yeah, I don't want to make that a lifestyle choice of being in constant dehydration, but do you know like how much your physical power decreases when you are dehydrated? Do you know what happens to your brain and how you respond? And you can read about it, but when you're feeling it and you're in it, that's completely different. And some people have never experienced that. And I think there's a way to do it without putting yourself in danger. Obviously, you're not going to try to push it to like 2.5 days without drinking water, but there's a way to experience it. So I always try to like incorporate that in my life randomly. I mean, even something, taking a cold shower, like, who really wants to do it? But when you do it, it's like, again, it's okay. I'm uncomfortable. It's raining. I'm going to go out for a walk anyway. I'm going to, see what it's like to be outside in a t-shirt for a minute with, no coat on in the winter. Like, what's that feel like? And I mean, I've done the whole like ice baths. Like when I was going out and preparing for the Alaskan trip, I was spending a lot of time in ice baths and just kind of like training that part of, trying to use my breath to control my body's reaction to cold and dealing with that. And I think it's just like constantly finding different ways to take comfort away. And then like something like caffeine, like someone who drinks coffee every single morning, or 5 cups of coffee. Like I love coffee, but when I'm going out, it's like I want to know what's going to happen when I don't have caffeine, when I'm used to it. So I'll take breaks from caffeine and experience that. And like if I'm experiencing caffeine withdrawals, well, that's something that I need to know what that looks like for me as well. Sugar too, like if someone consumes a lot of sugar and then they don't have that in their life, like what does your body do with different kinds of diets if you're only having like plant and animal food to eat? It's like, I think it's good to just mix it up. Keeps it interesting.
You talk about being a weird kid, all right? Talk about roadkill, right? So I know you're a roadkill fanatic. Your best and your worst experience with roadkill.
I'll tell you my worst. I found a roadkill coyote, and it was definitely not the freshest. And for the record, I've never gotten sick, knock on wood, from eating roadkill. It was not the freshest, and it ended up tasting like cheese. Like when I cooked it, it smelled like cheese. When I ate it, it tasted like cheese, and it was a terrible experience. Somehow I didn't get sick from it, but it was definitely my worst roadkill experience. I mean, but pretty much every other situation I've had with eating roadkill has been my best, because it's like, it just checks all the boxes as far as being, free range, local, organic, fresher than what you get in the store. Variety of meats, like very healthy, low fat meats, lean meats. I'd have to say my favorite is probably porcupine. It's just like, there's a reason they're covered in quills. They're delicious. And if they weren't, everything would just eat them all the time. Like, they're so good. But it was definitely a learning process for me, like learning how to process it and develop this whole kind of series of tests for whether or not it's good to eat. But yeah, so far so good.
Wow. A lot of us are, especially Marines, are at our age rank. A lot of us are married, to high school sweethearts or whatever it may be, and whatever the reason why we get married to whoever it is we get married to, sometimes our passions in life, like traveling the outdoors or going to extreme locations, ain't exactly the thing that our significant others would like to partake in. Mm-hmm. And I'll just relate this story, and I want to get your thoughts on how do you balance all this. But my wife and I, we went to we planned this dream trip to the Himalayas in Nepal, and we went, and we had this one particular portion of the trip organized to go up into this remote area on this trekking journey, and we reached this point of no return, and our guide told my wife and I, all right, this is the point of no return. So if we continue one step further, like, we are going all the way. And at that point, my wife says, I want to go back. And I looked at her with this, like, you got to be shitting me. Like, we're on the other side of the world. We've talked about this thing. And so, but it ended up being the greatest thing ever, because I knew, looking back now, I'm glad that I like this beaten animal, we retreated down this mountain. And because had we gone forward and forced it, she would have hated it. Mm-hmm. And now all we talk about is, when can we get back? And so in that moment, there was like a lesson, even for me. And even then, we since have gone well beyond what that journey maybe would have taken us. I guess from your advice and experience, what do you have to, like, married to someone who this isn't like their passion? That's not how we want to spend a weekend, all right? And so what's your advice to guys like us, and even women like us? Because you have Staff Sergeant Annabelle here. She is probably one of our most highly qualified instructors, and she's dragging her husband up a mountain.
I love it. Well, I've definitely been there. For starters, I've definitely been the one dragging the significant other to a place they didn't want to go to, which is usually up a mountain. And, I think it's like, there's one thing to, want to invite this person into the world that you love so much, and like have them experience it. And there's like a little bit of like needling that needs to happen to do that. And then there's another part of it where it's like, are you valuing the experience more than that human relationship? Because I have, like, some of my closest friends wouldn't be caught dead doing half the stuff that I do. And that's great. And I know that when I want to do these like really intense experiences, like, maybe don't bring them, like, maybe start out slow. I do think there's something to be said about, like, the fact that you went on this trip and that you didn't abandon her. That's huge. And like, I could see where, that's a big thing as far as a relationship goes. Like, it would have been a very different outcome if you had been like, all right, babe, see you later. Like, I'm going, like, you can go back, it's like, or if you resented her after. Like, I think that it's like, you really have to look at it and think what you want to value. Like, the experience will be there. And if you really want it and this person doesn't, like, you can go and have it yourself. Or, you can work into that. But the fact that you're able to honor that relationship for what it is, like, that should always be more important. Because if there's one thing I've learned from spending all this time alone by myself, it's like, can I be alone? Absolutely. Like, do I have a great time alone? Yeah. Like, I love it. But at the same time, it also makes me realize how important those relationships are. And there's definitely a way to do it. And there's a way not to do it. And I think it's just like, the safety that you can give to a person, knowing that if they're getting in over their head and there still is an option to turn back, that you're not going to abandon them. That's huge. And then it's like, I'm sure that, she's going to be way more willing to go with you on another adventure, knowing that you had her back when she needed you to. And it's like, I think, communication in that regard and being willing to be flexible enough to change plans, it's like, then you can try new stuff and don't be attached to an outcome. And, there's a time to push it and there's a time to not. So good on you for doing the right thing. I hope you guys make it back there.
Yeah, I hope so too.
It's funny. I think one of the driving forces in my life when I was young, one of my family trips was to Acadia National Park in Maine. And there's this one mountain, and it's the first place that when the sun rises, it's the first place it hits the US, like on the new day, right? So you go up Cadillac Mountain and you watch the sunrise, and it's great. And My mom and my dad wanted to go and see the sunrise. My mom was going to sleep in. And so as, you know, kids, me and my two sisters, we got to choose if we wanted to go with our dad or stay with my mom in the hotel room. So I decided I wanted to go with my dad and see the sunrise. Well, you know, 3:30 in the morning rolls around and he wakes me up, and I decide I wanted to stay in and sleep instead of go with him. And 5 minutes after he left, of course, this is like before cell phones, I had a mental breakdown. Like, I'd woken up, I realized what I did, I freaked out, I wanted to go, and it wasn't an option anymore. And I regretted it so much. And I feel like that driving factor, or like the memory of like that trauma, for lack of a better word, as a kid, of like missing out on an experience, drove me throughout my entire adult life to like not miss out on an experience, and to be like, all right, this slight discomfort is going to be worth it in the end, and I'm going to regret it more if I don't do it. So I think there is something to be said. Like, for me, that's been a powerful motivator, is like that feeling like, you know, you missed out on something and maybe you want to go back. And I think that's like can be a really powerful thing.
So let's say the pandemic ends tomorrow. Where do you go? Where does Laura travel to?
I mean, it's antler hunting season in Montana, so honestly, I'm staying right here. But I really love Australia, and I like spending time over there. It's just, there's some really remote places you can get to, but
Yeah.
you know, if I'm like planning a big trip, the whole Mongolia thing, that's been up there for a while, and I don't know, there's no guarantees in life, so I feel like I got to do that one just because, you know, you never know.
Wow. Anything else? Well, Laura, I appreciate your time, and thank you. And I know we've taken at least an hour from you, but again, it's unique to spend time with someone of your background and of your quality. And thank you again for sharing some stories and your advice to us. And it's something that we'll take to heart.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored you guys had me. I really, really appreciated it.